introduce my dear friend E. Timothy Carroll. And he's had an interesting month prior to doing this program for us tonight. He has recently been in the British Isles, and he hiked the Kirkpatrick Mountain in Ireland near Clew Bay. Anybody know where that is? Oh, good. And how do you pronounce the name of the mountain?
It's Kirkpatrick, which the crow is the Gaelic word for high, I think.
Oh, High Patrick Mountain, okay.
441 AD, St. Patrick went to the top and threw everybody else off.
And I just asked him, he said he got a small award in London at a lovely Mayfair building, and I asked him what the award was, and I'm going to let him explain to you what that award was. Tim has been a member for a long time of a club that was started and had, a long time ago, and had Charles Dickens as a member. So it's one of Britain's very old club, and I'll let
With
Tim
very
finish.
old men.
Yes. And any woman? Probably not.
I get in trouble here because the membership is voted every 5 years how many want to have women join the club. And I was a member, have been a member for 45 years, and so far the percentage that want women in the club is up to 4%. So I'm in a lot of trouble. If they're British, I have no control over that crowd.
Okay, anyway, tell them the name of the club, and then you can go ahead and do your wonderful program about hand harvesting
Well,
cherries.
I got the award for living 45 years. I was doing a little project in London about the time Queen Elizabeth was having her 25th anniversary as Queen, and someone invited me to lunch at their club, and it's called the Savile Club, and the Latin motto is Sodalitas Convivium, the Society of Convivial Men. And so you sit in a common stable, and there were about 12 of us the first time, and somebody asked me a question, and an hour later they all looked at their watch and decided I was convivial enough. We're looking at the exit. So it's a long story, but the good news is I don't have to pay my dues for the rest of my life, so that's the answer to that. Now I'm going to say a few words that is going to make all of you the last thing you want to hear from someone with a slideshow, and that is, I need to start with my backstory. Now, that may take longer, and I'm particularly nervous to have Cal Jameson in the crowd, because if he raises his hands, you know I've said it wrong. So be gentle, will you, Cal? So, back in the 1930s, when my father was the only son of a hunk of property and he had a growing family, he kept planting more orchards, and they came to bear fruit in the mid-30s, so that he needed to hire pickers. And this hand picking of cherries, and I'm sure I've got the numbers wrong, but I think at the height of our production in the 50s, because we'd bought Mert Gilmore's farm, I think it was over 100 ton of cherries. Now, every box of cherries weighs around 30 pounds, so you only have to have 60 lugs of cherries is 1,000 pounds. So, I mean, it adds up very quickly. And what to do about this, because hand picking, nobody locally had time to do it. So my father, somewhere in the misty past, contacted a fellow named Joe Cavasos, and every spring, by some metric that I have no comprehension of, my father would walk through the orchards and say, we need this many pickers. And I honestly, sometimes, we had tons of cherries, sometimes it was hardly anything. And that Mother Nature was always very skittish with the cherry people. And yet I can never remember having too many pickers or too few. They just came and they picked, and about 6 weeks the cherries were off. At any rate, my story with the Cavasoses, Joe Cavasos, and my father goes back to 1935 for the first time. This is Joe and Josephine. She organized her life rather well and always had her babies right in the middle of cherry season. And she had 9 of them that I remember. And one of the reasons she did that was because my father always had laughed because he said he had to go all the way to Traverse City to find a wife, because everybody on the peninsula by this time had interbred with everybody else, and it was a little dangerous because that first generation from 9 different countries, a wonderful gene pool. And so both sets of my great-grandparents married somebody, you know, not more than 3 minutes walk from where they lived. But Dad got to town and married a Wilhelm, and they had a little department store, and they were one of 3 guys that built the Opera House. And my mother had a first cousin who was born the same week she was, and he became a baby doctor. And so he was at Munson Hospital as a young baby doctor in the 30s. And Josephine Cavasos was about to have a baby under a cherry tree, and my mother hauled her into town. And Munson's Hospital said, "Oh, no, we don't have Mexicans in our hospital." So my mother, who was not a woman to shy away from an issue, put her foot down on the back of Cousin Emmanuel and said, "This has got to stop." So she had her baby in a hospital the first time ever. This was about the 3rd or 4th one. And she never missed a summer. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people trooped in behind her, and the rest is history. At least that was my mother's story. But they lived in San Antonio, Texas. As far as I know, they were certified Americans, but we didn't fuss about that in those days. And they would leave at some point with his truck and a load of people and go to Oklahoma to do something with sugar beets and then someplace else. And they always were in Sandusky, Ohio, hoeing tomatoes. When, I don't know who initiated the call, but either Dad would get a hold of Joe or otherwise. "How many pickers do you need, Mr. Carroll?" And Dad would have some number. So in due course, they would appear. This was a little... This is our big barn that my dad tore down at one point, but this is the beginning of their family. And I think that is probably earlier from the cars, because they came shortly after that this way. And that's the house I live in now. My great-grandparents built, and my grandparents lived there. And that's Joe. And this is how they would arrive, with a tarpaulin over the top, and they would have a few of their belongings. This is a better picture. They come down the hill. The driveway used to go straight down the hill, and this is, oh wait, this is my favorite.
Oh, I love it.
I'm just saying. Here we have, notice this, which came from San Antonio with them. Because later on you will see them getting ready for church on Sundays, and they've all got white shirts, and how they did it without, you know, any quibbling at all. But you see, there was always a group of families who came, and then there would always be a collection of single men. And so the deal was every family would take a row, and the single men would work together as a family and have a row. And that's how they would pick 100-ton of cherries without much fuss. And you know, to them, this was their life. And so you had things like domestic pets that came along, and odds and ends. And we supplied the housing, mattresses, cooking stoves, not just cooking stove, well, and then the straps and the buckets and the ladders. And in fact, one of my jobs, as soon as I could drive, was to go to Interlochen Music Camp, where they would sell their mattresses every year. And we had a little pickup truck that I was driving, and you could get the single mattresses, and so I could pile about a dozen of them in the back. And one time I was driving home, and they were sort of flying off, and there was a fellow hitchhiking at the forks of the road. So I said, I said, "I'll pick you up if you'll sit on top of the mattresses." And he said, "I love you." And I said, "Well, thank you very much, but you can sit on top of the mattresses." And he said, "Because I love you." Well, he wanted to go to I Love You Road, which would be Island View Road. Just a small tale of how the cherry business really ran. They picked 5.5 days a week. At noon, Oh, and this was Jimmy Cavazos and his wife Petra. They were unusual because they had no children. But she was a bit of an entrepreneur, and although she would be picking along, she had some kind of container and would make shaved ice and put some juice on it, and sold, they called it raspa. And you could get anybody who had a nickel or a dime or whatever, she was really pocketing the money. But they had this Scotty dog which came along with them too, wherever they went to go picking. And so it unfolded. And this is Grandpa Cavazos. He and Grandma Cavazos came every year, and they used to stay in the apple storage building because it was partly underground. It was the coolest building. It had no windows, and it was very cool in the summertime. And they reigned superior there and picked together, Grandma and Grandpa did. This is an earlier picture. This is Josephine with some of the kids. It doesn't look like anybody did much trimming on our trees, does it? I don't remember. We weren't the most diligent of farmers, I'm afraid. And this is an example of the light sweets. Now, those of you who aren't cherry farmers, they're sort of the first ones off the trees, and this fellow is, I think, standing on top of his ladder, but a pretty good crop that year. I presume that's why the picture was taken. Here is Raymond de Leon, who was the oldest boy of the de Leon family, who were related to the Cavazoses, and this was his younger brother. And Raymond got into the army at some point and didn't like it very much, so he got himself out of the army. And in the middle of the cherry season, about 1947, 48, Sheriff Weiler, who always on Saturday night would make a tour of the peninsula, and he always stopped to get a cup of coffee from my mother, but he was looking, he had an FBI agent because somebody had gone AWOL from the army, and they thought for sure that they were working at our farm. So my sister Colleen likes to remember this because Dad carried her down. Well, we'll go down and see if we can find the lad. And so they went down and they asked Mr. Cavazos if they knew anybody named Raymond de Leon, and they said, Raymond de Leon? I don't think so. No, and he's standing right there, of course, but by God, we pushed the FBI back and he was never taken away, because he was a good picker. Again, to mess with that sort of thing. Here's how the ladies used to protect their hair, and we've moved up to the tart cherry part of it. You see they have the straps in the bucket. And you know, I may be wrong about the 100-ton, but it was a lot of cherries. And we had, it seems to me, the most we ever had was probably 40 to 50 pickers. And it usually lasted 6 weeks. But every one of those things were picked by hand. And you had to be very careful. Each family had a number on a card that they put in the lug, which was around 30 pounds. Cal says 28, but I think ours were fatter, actually. And then they would stack them, and we would come through with the tractor and trailer to load it up, which I'll picture up in a minute. And that went on from, sun up to sundown. This again was another sweet cherry tree. It looks massive. And somebody who isn't picking, which is not a good idea. Now this is a great picture. It was very popular. His dad used to have slideshows to show everybody. Here's Grandma Cavazos and Grandpa Cavazos. And the minute everybody saw this picture, they had started screaming with laughter, our Mexican pickers. And we had to ask why. Well, because Grandma's is full and Grandpa's isn't. So that's a little cherry humor for you. Here again are the De Leon family, and they, she was a particularly good cook, was Mrs. De Leon, and my father loved Mexican food, so once a year she'd bring up a plate, which I have a picture of later on, and Mrs. Cavazos would then vie. She had the chicken con mole, which Dad was fond of, and that was. This is a picture we just put in because I couldn't find any with showing the ladders, which were, you had to use the top of the tree so that you had the kids and the wives sort of picking up as far as they could reach, and then the young men and older men in the trees, so that as you go down the row, you wouldn't leave a tree until you had cleaned the fruit of it. And of course, you had to pick through your pail here to make sure you had the leaves and the stems out. So I mean, it was an arduous process, and as I say, it went on from sun up to sundown. Now, one of the things, we had a 2-ton Studebaker truck, and every night after it was the end of picking, we would, my older brother would put everybody on the truck, and our farm went as far as the East Bay. Everybody, pickers and non-pickers, anybody working went down and went swimming, and cooled off and got clean for the next day. And that's how we kept the thing going. Now, this is an example of a trailer load of lugs coming in from the orchard, and they would be brought in, and it took about 3 of these trailer loads to fill the 2-ton truck, which would be taken to Traverse City. Cherry Growers Incorporated was something that my grandfather was a member of, which is a cooperative, it was on the land where the culinary institutes on one side and the marine academies on the other. That was owned by the Cherry Growers Incorporated at the time. And this is me with amazing buck teeth. I don't remember having those, but and here's a lug, the infamous lugs. And as soon as you could lift 30 pounds, your job was to haul them in. And my job as a teenager was to make sure that the family's tickets were all counted and everybody agreed that they had gotten that many for the day. And then every Saturday noon at about maybe 1 o'clock, my father would sit with a cash box on the porch of my grandmother Carol's house, the house I live in now, the corner which is right there. And all the men, or whoever was getting the money, would be in a line waiting, and I'd be going along and saying, you really did have 79, and they'd say, I think we had 78. I said, fix the number. So, I mean, if there was more, whatever they said, I agreed upon. So they got the cash money at that point. This is Saturday noon. And in Antrim County and Grand Traverse County and the Mapleton Peninsula and the Old Mission Peninsula and Leelanau, everybody went to Traverse City to buy a week's full of groceries, to buy a toy for their kids. We used to be so envious. They get these big stuffed dolls and everything. And I have a picture of that in a minute. This was an earlier shot, but this is Joe Cavasos, and there was always at least 3 or 4 or 5 guys that played guitars, and maybe there'd be a squeeze box. And they would often sit under, we had 8 maple trees by the center road there, and they'd sit under the trees after they'd had their supper and sing songs that was right out of a bad movie, except they were singers. And here is Raymond De Leon's annual, Mrs. De Leon sending my father his favorite Mexican meal. But again, this is Sunday. There he is in a white shirt. Somebody who's been picking cherries all week, and yet they managed to keep all the clothes clean and everything. In fact, here are some of them coming back from town, and you see they have their slacks on and their nice clean shirts and everything. And they did that with a minimum of, they had water from a tap, but they had to heat it somehow. But this is Clinch Park. Now this is before the Traverse City, before the Parkway. So when you were at the corner of Cass and Front Street, you could take a right there and go down, and it was all, there had been a railroad track there, so that had been pulled up. So it was just this big dirt thing. In fact, this is the back of the State Theater. So to equate yourself, and you've got the Boardman River running this way. And I never knew Pratt and Gleason had a Traverse City extension. I thought they were strictly Old Mission, but there they are in Traverse City too. And here they are, the pickers. Now mind you, there were three nationalities of pickers. And you never mixed your farm with them. So you either had an all Spanish-speaking set of pickers, or you had a African-American set of pickers, or you had a white set of pickers who were known at the time, well, everybody had a nickname, but you never mixed those three up. You were one or the other, which was a very wise thing I did. Socially, it worked for everybody. Now, of course, the Mexicans in the community, and they said that there were like 50,000 people on a Saturday afternoon in Traverse City spending their money from the three counties. But of course, all the Spanish-speaking people were Catholic, and this is the old St. Joseph's Church, and an example of what Sundays looked like there, because very early on, the St. Joseph Ladies Altar Society would find themselves a Spanish-speaking priest someplace and bring them up for the summer. And so in the middle 40s, probably after the war, they started doing teaching catechism on Sundays after Mass for the Spanish families. And back to Josephine, in the middle of cherry season in 1952, they had a 1 or 2 year old child who just suddenly died. And it was nothing that we'd ever handled before, but my mother, every Sunday, all these people would go to Catholic church, and so my mother said, we're going to have a full, proper funeral for this baby, and she organized the Ladies' Altar Society and everything else. And I've been looking at this picture. These were the little girls that they organized to walk alongside the casket of this little baby girl. I kept looking at this girl, and I said, she looks so familiar. It's my sister, Michelle. And somehow the ladies got all this stuff together. And in fact, Mother made sure that there's a stone monument on one of our gravesites in St. Joe's with Ruthie Cavasos' name on it. But that sad event got the ladies' club thinking about, why don't we have First Communion? Because we could teach them their little catechism and all their picking cherries. And so the first year, this was the catechism class that made their, it's something in the Roman Church that you have to do to become, I don't know, a Catholic, I guess. But the boys and girls and the Ladies' Altar Society either made the dresses or got them somehow. And this was a Spanish-speaking priest that they came up with the first year. This was the second year they did it. This is little Father Barrett. You might have remembered him. He was here for about 10 years. And these are three ladies, obviously from the St. Joseph's Altar Society, but I don't recognize any of them. But I was already, anyway, it got to be quite a thing. And like my sisters got involved in teaching, they go out in the orchard and teach them their little catechism stuff. And so that's what they did on Sundays.
It was awful lonesome at Mapleton when you had catechism.
I was never very good at catechism. So when finally, it usually never more than 6 weeks, but always a little hangover more than 5 weeks. Somehow the cherries were all off. And so my dad sprung for a few cases of beer and a whole lot of soda pop and ice cream for everybody. And we had a fiesta. And they would, one of the big buildings that had been petitioned off for the different families that live in would be opened up, and they would, all these musicians, of course, could play and have the dancing. And there's my co-producer didn't want me to show the picture of my mother dancing with Grandpa Cavasos, but here he is dancing with his daughter-in-law, and they don't look very happy for a fiesta. But that's how we used to end the season. And my dear grandmother, who was living the house I live in, she was really in the midst of much more of the Mexican summer than my folks were. They were further north. But she always used to say, I love to see them come and I love to see them go. But it was how we picked cherries by hand until 1960-ish, when the federal government, in its wisdom, decided to change the tariff laws, and they could undersell our cherries by foreign growers, and they also decided that all migrant pickers should have hot and cold running water, they should have flush toilets, etc., etc. And I'm sure they were right, except we had managed to get along quite nicely without their help. So within 3 years of these proposed rules coming down, Arnold White and his gang out here had put together a mechanical picker, and 50,000 migrant workers were out of work. Hello. One of the final stories is that in 1952, my father decided over a 3-week Christmas holiday that we would drive out to Arizona to visit Harold Lardy and my father's cousin, Aunt Neva Lardy, who had the garage at Mapleton. And they had sold that in 1946, and Uncle Harold had bought GM stock with it, so they were not hurting. So Dad, who had never driven out of south of Michigan, had his little map of the country, and we all, 5 of us got in the car and drove straight south and then straight west, and stopped at every tin pot museum and had a look, and got a nickel for the Nickelodeon at lunch every day. And we got to San Antonio, and somehow, again by some metric, Mr. Cavasos and my father had talked, and they had invited us to their home in San Antonio for dinner. Well, we had our hotel in San Antonio, and so Dad, we're driving and driving, and we get to this part of the city where there are no lights, no street lights. There's no street, actually. It's kind of a dirt road, and there are holes and things, and houses are all made of cement blocks, and somehow we arrive, and there's Joe and Josephine and 2 of the older boys. We get out, and Joe says, Mr. Cavasos said to my father, well, my big boys are going to watch your car. Watch your car. And so we went into the house, and the biggest room was the dining room, and they had it set for the 5 of us, and they stood around while they served up this Mexican dinner, and we played some songs, they played some songs, and we sang. We had a whole evening together. It was a very unusual thing for the Carrolls from Traverse City, Michigan, who had never seen anything like it. And we got back in the car to go back to the hotel. And I always think about my parents, who could have played it in such a different way, but all the way back they kept saying, well, wasn't that interesting, and weren't they kind, and it's so interesting to see how they live, and there wasn't any sort of backlash about how poor and frankly awful the place was. And I think that perhaps helped me understand that I should spend a little time of my life in the third world. Thank you for spending your time with me. Any questions I would be delighted to answer. Once Dad had gotten a hold of Mr. Cavasos, he was really set. And I presume Mr. Cavasos got a little bit of percentage for bringing the people themselves. But he was totally reliable, I must say, and it was a wonderful combination, a binary product of the cherry season.
So where did you say this family was from? Arizona or Texas?
They lived, Joe Cavasos and his family and the De Leons for sure had houses in San Antonio, Texas. We were driving through to Arizona to visit. We were just one night in San Antonio and had this lovely dinner party.
So when they drove up here in that truck, with everybody just standing in the back?
Well, remember, they were only going from Sandusky, for our segment, they were only going from Sandusky, Ohio to Traverse City. So that would be not more than a day, even with 2-lane highways. Mm-hmm. So yes, well, I think I was never in the truck, but they had mattresses in. I mean, I think they had places to sit down as well, or lay down maybe. And there was always one or two cars running along beside them, and sometimes there were 2 trucks and no cars. I mean, it was a kind of a little cavalcade that arrived. And as I say, they'd been doing it, and I don't have the steps clear, but I know for sure they did sugar beets in Oklahoma, and something, and maybe something else, and then the tomatoes in Ohio, and then Traverse City, and then back to the tomatoes, because they were hoeing them in the first place and then picking them in the second place. But they too had their routine, and I presume Mr. Cavasos had a Fred Carroll at every one of these places. Because I mean, that made him, you know, a middle class kind of an entrepreneur, that he was organizing all this. And totally reliable, and dear Josephine, ever pregnant.
Amazing.
Actually, about 5 years after I'd retired back here, I had a Dutch family come to visit me, and I was showing them around the peninsula, and we drove back into my driveway, and there were about 8 people wandering around my front yard as if, you know, they belonged there. And there was one extremely attractive woman with very tall and lovely white hair, and I said, "Can I help you?" And she said, "Well, is Fred here?" And I said, "No, Fred's died." "But is Terry here?" "No, Terry's died." "Is Auntie Ethel here?" My Auntie Ethel was a maiden lady who lived all of her life with my grandmother and was a little bit handicapped and a very funny person. But Auntie Ethel wasn't here. And she said, "Well, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm Tim." She said, "Oh, Timmy, you've gotten old." And I said, "Well, you've got white hair, dear." But Grandma and Grandpa Cavasos always had 2 or 3 single girls who were always really good looking. And they were maybe even more than teenagers, but hadn't gotten their husbands yet. But this woman, and I'm blocking her name, had actually sent my father a picture of her wedding out, because she got married, and it was one of these very elaborate Spanish weddings, and she's in all of this regalia, and then she got great big puffs full of stuff out the side, and I was able to go in because my father had that picture, and he always kept his ledger for all of his numbers work, and he sticks stuff that he liked in that ledger, and just flipped through that, and that brought her out to show her the picture of her wedding dress. Oh, she was so happy. Man.
So I just wanted to emphasize again what a huge shift that was when Shakers came in, because
Catatonic.
I remember
I mean tectonic.
Dad had such a hard time when those Shakers came in, because you form relationships with
Right.
these families. The same people come every year. I just remember him, you know, really having a tough time with the whole shift of, well, we don't need these people. And he was worried about the people too, because their
Well, I mean,
job was
it
gone.
was absolutely a symbiotic relationship. Without them, you know, we had no.
We were the same, Jane. We so looked forward to those trucks coming up
Right.
the driveway. We were
Yeah.
so rural at that time. I'm sure, like your Kim said, I love to see them come, but I love to see them go. I think Verla would second that. But as 6 kids just wanting something other than a cherry tree to hug, we were like, they're here! So excited!
Tacos all around.
Oh, when Mom and Dad would take the rare night out, we would invite Mrs. Maltos into Verla's home to do an entire meal. And then my older brother Kim would clean the entire thing up before they got home, and we never confessed until they were like in their 70s. I'm like, did you know we would have Mrs. Maltos over? And my mother would say, that woman had enough to do. Same thing. Forever pregnant, 80 million children of her own, and my brother Kim is inviting her to cook for 6 more children.
Well, and I'm sure Jamie was the same way with you. Some of those kids were my first best friends.
Absolutely,
You
Jane.
know?
Well, my Aunt Iva, who married Les Gore, and of course it was a terrible family feud because he was a Methodist.
Praise the Lord.
But they had 9 lovely children and lived right in the middle of Ogdensburg, and they always had white pickers, which were known colloquially as hillbillies,
Yeah.
because they mostly came from hills down south, I guess. But she had a woman friend that she used to, the woman friend, and she were good enough that she would come in And Aunt Iva the one thing she wanted to do, this woman every year, was to come in to Aunt Iva's house and go into the bedroom and sit and go through Aunt Iva's jewelry case. Now, Aunt Iva didn't have much jewelry, but this woman, and then she would tell Aunt Iva stories, and this woman would be reminiscing, and Aunt Iva, she'd finish her story, and then she would say to Aunt Iva, "Oh, dem were the days," which became part of Aunt Iva's lexicon when she was reminiscing about her own life. And of course, she married the Methodist. What did she have to say?
Something I found just astounding was it was well known that Saturday was payday in 3 counties and that it was cash payment. However, that I'm aware of was never an incident of anyone being...
And it was cash,
And
absolutely
it was
pure
cash.
cash.
I mean,
yeah.
and a lot of times it was like my mom ran the cash box. So, you know, Dad would go to town or whoever, the cash for the weekend was there. She was the dispenser, but never an issue anywhere, either to or from town with that load of cash or anything.
And Joe Cavasos always said they actually made the most money in cherries. But my God, what grueling work. But of course, hoeing tomatoes can't be any fun either. And this business of in the night, they would, you know, before they went to bed, they would be singing some songs and just they must have these wonderful people. And my father, the day my sister Colleen was born, my grandmother bought my father an Argus C3 slide camera, and the first picture he took was my baby sister in the kitchen sink, naked, getting bathed. She was about this big. And he took pictures of everything. In some place, the trouble is they're not organized in any way, shape, or form. It's a big box and you dig through them. But someplace, there's a couple of nice-looking girls walking back from St. Joe's Church and coming down the driveway, and the clotheslines are filled with, they look like diapers or towels or something, all white claws being, you know, waving in the wind, getting ready for the next week's work, I suppose. And I don't remember ever watching anybody over the wash tub, except there was the wash tub. But they managed it all, you know, and of course we did have outhouses, and we had, they had access to faucets and hoses. And it's just, that's the way it was, and nobody griped about it. And they always loved the swimming part. That was an addition they didn't get anyplace else. Go swimming in the evening. And we were right there along with them. We'd rather swim than go take a shower, for these days, you know. And, so that was, would you like to add anything, Cal? You probably had a bigger operation, you Jamesons.
No, we weren't bigger. We, 1,500 lugs a day to Elk Rapids.
1,500
So
bucks a day.
I got to live in that truck, that scoop.
Well, and you know, Brother Terry got to go, but they had an ice cream place across from the cherry growers.
Yeah.
But sometimes he wouldn't get back till 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd have another load ready for him to go. I never got to go to town, of course. I was not my father's ideal child, I'm afraid. Why he didn't drown me in a horse trough is because we didn't have a horse trough. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
I want to give special thanks to Mary Morgan, who, as you know, is the brains behind this whole operation. And frankly, I've never had a more severe boss. She does not brook fools gladly. And we've been making a book that I'm sure you're all desperate to see. For 3rd graders, a local history of the peninsula. It was somebody's great idea. And if you notice anything, I'm now speaking in a 3rd grade vocabulary. And it turns out, while I write the text, I have to check with 3rd graders. This may be news to you. 3rd graders love exclamation points. So there's a lot of, and the coloring book, it's a coloring book. Adventures with Young Tim. Again, thank you.
No, thank you.